I have to just say that it's one of the best possible things, I think, for an architect to do is to spend a good chunk of time working for a contractor, working in construction.
Episode 104.
This is The Business of Architecture.
Hello, Architect Nation. I'm Enoch Sears, and this is the show where each week I speak with a successful architect, designer, or consultant to discuss tips, strategies, and secrets for running a profitable and impactful architecture practice. Today's show is sponsored by BQE Software, the makers of ArchiOffice. ArchiOffice is the office and project management software built with the needs of architects in mind. And for a limited time, startup firms can get 2 free seats of ArchiOffice for a year. Go check it out at archioffice.com. When you speak to the folks over at BQE Software, please mention this show, because when you use ArchiOffice, you support Business of Architecture, which allows me to continue bringing you this content. Today, I welcome 2 guests to the show. First, we have architect Rand Sellner. Rand is the owner and principal of Home Architects, a nationwide practice specializing in custom residential architecture. Rand is also on the executive committee of Architects Creating Homes, an American organization of licensed architects focusing on residential architecture. Also joining us today is Marilyn Modinger, educator, architect, and founder of Runcible Studios, an architecture firm located in Boston, Massachusetts. In today's episode, we're talking about construction documents. In this episode, you'll discover the career route Marilyn Modinger has taken that has given her a powerful advantage as an architect, as well as how to make your construction drawings more understandable and clear so that you can minimize job site errors and questions. And with that, here's today's show. So welcome, Rand and Marilyn, to Business of Architecture.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So first of all, Marilyn, I just wanted to ask you about the name of your studio, Runcible, because that's an interesting name. Can you give us the backstory on that?
Sure. Well, Runcible is a word that was coined by Edward Lear, a poet, in his poem, The Owl and the Pussycat. And it was the very first book that I ever read when I was a little girl. And he never defined the word exactly, but it's mostly understood to mean an object of utility and beauty. It's also sort of a nonsense word, and I kind of like that combination.
Excellent. So, and do you get many questions from potential clients or people who are wondering, where does this name come from?
You know, I thought I would get a lot more questions than I do. Actually, it's split 50-50. People who say, I know that word, the Owl and the Pussycat, I love that poem. And half of people are like, what is that? And either one is great because, you know, I get to explain the story and tell the story, or, you know, I get to have an immediate connection with someone who knows the same sort of strange esoteric poem, kid's poem.
Absolutely. I wrote that down. I'm going to go read that, look it up, read that to my kids. So Marilyn, tell me a little bit about your practice. Do you specialize in residential architecture? I
do, yeah. Right now, so my studio is 1 year old as of 2 weeks ago. And so most of my projects are single family residential. Some are ground up, some are renovations, some have a historic component to them. And my professional background has been housing, multifamily, and single family, and some commercial work in there, but my studio focuses on residential architecture.
Okay, excellent. Well, you know, we started off by getting to know Marilyn a little bit better. Rand, this is the second time you're back on the show, so welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, and before we dive into, you know, talking about ArchSpec, I just wanted to give our listeners who don't know about it a little background on ArchCH. So let's talk about that for a little bit, but to give our listeners an overview, Rand Sellner, he's really been the driving force behind this. And I think the seed of it was planted when he saw that there wasn't an organization out there, in the U.S. anyways, that had the best interest of residential architects at heart. And he felt like the existing organizations didn't have the resources he was looking for. And he sort of felt like, I don't know, sometimes we all feel like that as residential architects, like a small cog in a big wheel in some of these larger organizations that focus on corporate architecture. So Rand, can you give us the minute summary of how ArchCH came about, the idea and the vision, and then a little bit about your drive and passion to create this group and this organization?
Sure. Thanks, Enoch. Uh, Arch began with three licensed architects that were members of other organizations, and we felt, like you said, that it's kind of a dispossessed position to be in America, and we felt that unfortunately other organizations also seem to allow membership of unlicensed people, and we think that there was a conflict with respect to the best interests of licensed architects who are in direct competition with unlicensed people, although they don't have the education, the experience, the licensure that provides the same level of service competency, et cetera. And so we felt that also that there was inadequate funding for organizations that were kind of the red-haired stepchildren of larger organizations, and they didn't really have a source of funding or adequate. And so we felt, you know what, we think we're just better off starting fresh and clean. And so in 2012, we began Arch, and we started with the acronym first, Arch, and then we had to figure out, gee, what's this really mean? And so we really worked for about a month. We finally came up with Architects Creating Homes. And
it works beautifully. I mean, it's just perfect.
And that was not arrived at. That simplicity, just like a fine Mies van der Rohe design, it was not achieved easily. Went through a lot of vetting and a lot of discussion to arrive at that simplicity. And so we've grown from then. We now have members, including yourself, from California through North Carolina, and from Chicago down through Fort Lauderdale. And we're growing every year, and we can continue to create products now for Arch members, which simply don't exist for licensed architects who design homes. You've got these gigantic Bibles for like specifications, like I wrote for Jurassic Park. I was the architect of record on about half of that for Universal Studios down in Orlando several years ago. And we use big commercial specs to do that. And you get a 2,000-page Bible. That's what happens. But when you're doing design for homes, which are among the absolutely the most complex kind of projects you can do, there was nothing. And so we started essentially from scratch decades ago and have been perfecting this ever since. And every time something happened, and all of us, I think, will understand what I mean by this, things happen to us in our practices every day that are either embarrassing or difficult or have liability concerns or make us feel somehow that we didn't do as good a job as perhaps we should have had we known more or had we had more experience. And so those are the kind of things that get tucked into Arch Spec. And there's like about 30 years of those in Arch Spec. So all those little lessons learned, all those hard knocks that all of us get are in there. And so those people that buy Arch Spec get the advantage of having decades of seasoned licensed architects knowledge in there put into things like that. So it's the kind of thing that, like, I'll never let that happen again.
Yeah.
And you either put that in your contract or you put that in your specs. And so those that were appropriate for specs are in there. Yeah. And it's not just things that, although liability is one good thing, and it helps you limit that, but there's things in there that just make for better architecture for residences and small commercial. There's just so many good things in there, like a declaration of what the energy requirements are for the climatic zone that you're in, and it does it in a graphic and textual manner. There are references for building codes right out of our IRC.
Before we jump into the exact, what's in Arch Spec, I'm glad you started talking about the formation of it, where it came from, the lessons learned. What I'd like to do is just have a little group conversation here, because Marilyn actually has a background working for a contractor, and so she can probably bring a lot of insight to the conversation. What I'd like to talk about between ourselves is, what are some of the common deficiencies or mistakes or problems that happen once a project leaves the office, once the drawings leave the office and go into the field? What are these common lessons learned that have accrued over the past 30 years? So maybe between the two of you, if you could each input a couple of common things that you've seen in the past or problems that typically typically pop up, and then we'll move on to talk about how a good set of specs can help solve that, and maybe some other things we can do in our drawings to prevent those things from happening.
Well, Marilyn, why don't you go ahead and start that off from the perspective of working with a construction firm, and tell us about all the issues that you might have had not having specs available.
Yeah, we would love that.
Well, I think one of the things, so I worked for a contractor in Charlottesville, Virginia, for about 4 years. And it was after I got a degree in architecture, a bachelor's degree. And I have to just say that it's one of the best possible things, I think, for an architect to do, is to spend a good chunk of time working for a contractor, working in construction. Can
I pause you there just for 1 second, Marilyn? Because it is interesting that you graduated with an architecture degree and then yet you went to work for a contractor. Can you tell me a little bit about how that happened? Because I don't know one single person who graduated with me that would have even wanted to work for a contractor. So something must have happened there that was a little different for you. Yeah,
the thing that happened was my 4th year of undergrad, I went to University of Virginia. And my 4th year of undergrad, I had the privilege of participating in a project called EcoMod, which is run by John Qualley, who's now at University of New Mexico. And that was a design build project that was the first time it was done. And basically, we spent a year designing an affordable, modular, sustainable house that for a local housing nonprofit. And then we started building it. We built it in an airplane hangar outside of Charlottesville, and it was all students. I was one of the co-project managers as an undergrad, and so I spent the summer building, and I realized a lot of things. I realized the loss in translation that comes between drawing and the field, and I especially noticed that the loss was greater when we first started, because we hadn't ever built anything. As the summer went on, we got better at drawing because we were better at building. And I couldn't picture going to work in an office. After that, I was bitten by the bug, and I really wanted to learn more. So I went into contracting, and I like to say, as the assistant to the assistant. And I had a lot of really great mentors and a lot of people who took me under their wing and taught me a lot, and threw me into the deep end more often than not.
And on the flip side, Marilyn, I'm just going to pause you there as well. Pardon the interruption, but on the flip side, I think from a contractor's perspective, a lot of them would be thinking, hey, I'm not going to hire someone with an architecture degree. We know about those architects. Did you have any of that resistance as you were trying to get a job with a contracting firm?
No, not at all. They asked me to come work for them. So, they were enthusiastic to have me on board. And I think they certainly did take a risk. I had no real construction experience besides building that house. They took a risk, and I took to it pretty well. So, I really loved it. It worked out great.
Great. And then what were your lessons during those first years working for a contractor, being on that side of the fence?
Oh my gosh. Well, I could fill like the rest of the hour with those. So I will.
Let's take 10 minutes or 5 minutes.
Exactly. So one of the things I think if we're talking about specs in particular or drawings or that kind of thing, one of the most important lessons, that I saw was, so first of all, as a contractor, I got to work with many, many different sets of drawings. It was a fascinating place to compare notes, basically. I saw way more different styles of drawing and styles of spec writing than I would have if I would have worked in a single office. And not only did I see them, but I had to execute them. So, I might be working on several sets of drawings at once for several different projects and trying to build them. And there's no commonality, like there's commonalities, but there's no there's a lot of latitude in the way that sets are put together and that specs are written. And so one of the most important things that I saw happen that was super helpful was having the specs included in the drawing set. And it seems like a really small thing, but not having that separate book of specs was really great. there were many times when I would go out, when I was project managing, and I would go out to the site and I would see the spec book being used as a doorstop or whatever, because it's just huge and cumbersome, and no one was poring over it like they maybe should have been, to know all the details of installing something or whatever. So it seems like a tiny thing, but actually having the specs in as the last sets of pages was really, really helpful as a contractor. And that's how I've done everything since I've been drawing things.
Let me push your pause button there for you, Enoch. The way that Arch Spec does it, tell them, Marilyn.
Well, that's part of the reason why I was particularly interested in it, because it's just several pages at the end of your drawing set that you insert. So instead of a separate book. So
excellent. And then all the notes then go back and reference those specification sections. So,
yeah.
Okay, so in addition to having drawing specs, which I agree is an awesome idea, and the first time I saw it, I thought it was brilliant, and something I also do in my own drawings. But tell us, what are some other lessons, Marilyn, that you picked up working for a contractor?
I think understanding materials in a more, and assemblies in a more realistic way, I guess. When we draw things, it's a perfect line. Like we draw a line that indicates plywood, and it's a perfect line, or a line that indicates two materials coming together and being nailed together or screwed together. Actually, materials are rougher and more ornery than that, so they don't always come together perfectly. So I have a much better idea of tolerance, and what different tolerances are of different materials, what you can ask of different materials, what things you can do in the field versus what things you shouldn't do in the field. Those types of things. I think understanding how things go together is kind of that's a broader way of saying it, but actually how, what you can and can't ask materials to do. And so for me, that narrowed it in some ways, things that I drew as a student or as a beginning designer, like, no way, that could never be done. But it also broadened it, and knowing the materials and knowing what a piece of plywood might be able to do, or the ways you can join it. And then also knowing your crew and knowing what their capabilities are, and how you can work with them to get creative. That was always my favorite part, is when someone wanted to work with me instead of just administer drawings to me. There's a lot talk about, collected knowledge, and talk about craft and skill, and things that aren't exactly written down or learned from books. That capitalizing on that skill and knowing the team that you're working with is really, really helpful too. So it's a little harder to sort of pin down, but.
So you said that you were able to look at dozens of architects' drawings and compare them on a daily basis. Doing that probably gave you a good eagle's eye view of things that you saw, best practices that you thought were good versus practices that you thought, that really doesn't work out too well. Can you give me a couple of the takeaways that you've personally picked up after having that kind of education, in terms of, give me a couple examples of things where, maybe mistakes that you saw architects commonly making on their drawings, and then other things besides the specs that you saw that were useful?
One thing that some of these may be regional. So I learned all of this in Central Virginia, which now that I'm living in Boston and New England, there are differences. And that's one of the fun parts about construction, I think. One of the things that is always interesting is dimensioning drawings. So how you dimension things, how you call out things like dimensions. I used to dimension to what my client would want to see. Like, oh, they want to know that this room is this big or that big. And when I was building, I saw a lot of drawing sets come my way that were dimensioned that way. But that's not actually how the framers need to know. So they don't want to know like the edge of the rough opening in wood. They want to know the center line, because they have to figure out what the window, they look up what the window is, and then they figure out, based on the center line. So things like that because I tried to build off of drawings that were nonsense, like that didn't make sense for how people build. the drawings are a set of instructions how to build. They're not a sales document for clients. So, and I think sometimes we try to make them both, and they can't be. I like the idea that the set of drawings is actually the contract. It's just in visual form, because if we try to write out everything, like place this window 1 foot beside that one, we would never be able to do it. So, so this idea of if it's an instruction kit as to how to build, then you have to draw it how it's built. So that was one of the things I struggled with, was dimensioning a lot when I was trying to build things, trying to figure out what is the intention.
Yeah, let's just jump into dimensioning really quick. Let's talk about dimensioning best practices. So dimension to center line of windows, dimension to center line of doors. What else?
Yeah. Well, so this is just me. I feel like I should put like this big, this is just me.
We understand that. Yeah, let's talk about it.
And all these things are...
Well, I would think dimensioning to rough framing as opposed to finishes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the framers don't care like what the drywall opening is necessarily when they're framing. So the other one that I really liked, that I use all the time now, and it sometimes can be a pain, but I like directional or intentional dimensioning. So align is my favorite, like with the 2 lines with the arrows, like align these things. And to me, that I liked getting those kinds of notes when I was a contractor, because I was like, great, don't tell me how to do it. I'll figure it out. I know what you want in the end, so I'll get there. And that kind of it shows a faith in your in your crew who's building it, and it also just says, okay, because if you dimension everything out to the last little 16th of an inch, then they're going to follow that direction. But if you say, I don't care how you get there, but I want these 2 surfaces to align, then so that's another one. Align is a good one.
Good. Rand, do you have any input on the best practices for dimensioning from your experience?
Yeah, I think architects tend to do things that, like, they try to make things even, like concrete block 8 inches, for instance. It's really not a 7 5/8. And when you talk to contractors, they say, no, I don't want it to show 8 inches. I want it to show 7 5/8. And actually, if you dimension to just one side of it, what's the critical side? What's the side, like Marilyn says, that has to align with other things? So like when you're doing a fireplace and so forth, you want to show the dimension between the throat, where if you're building in a piece of UL rated equipment into that, you show what that critical dimension is. So showing what things actually are rather than nominal dimensions, which I think a lot of architects have gotten used to over the years, is I think what it really is what the contractor wants to know. Because if you've got a 100-foot long building, and let's say there's a lot of masonry involved, and you call every one 8 inches, that's not going to work out. And so a lot of dimensions, in fact, what we started doing probably about 20 years ago is just dimension to one side of the wall and say, hey, these are all 2x6s. And so we would dimension to the same side of that wall all the way through, so they can run a string and easily set a chalk line and go from that. Does that make sense to you, Marilyn?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I have done things where, when you're in CAD or whatever, you just hatch something to show that it's masonry or to show that it's tile or something. I generally won't figure out like where are the grout lines, where everything. I just say, this is what I want to align with what. This is how I want it to end up. And these are the critical moments of alignment or proportion. Because no matter how many times, no matter if I drew everything exactly perfectly with the joints between the masonry or whatever, I'm still not a mason. So I still don't have that. Like there would still be something that I would forget. And I had enough exposure to all of the trades when I was contracting that I now know that what I don't know is pretty vast. So I'd much rather talk to them about the intention than sit there and try and figure out exactly what the mortar line should be.
That brings up a great conversation. It's something I've wrestled with. I think there was a few years ago, maybe it was 5 or even a decade ago, there was an article the AIA put out, some writer, I can't remember, talking about the intent of drawings. How, you have to look at drawings in terms of the general intent, and that not, I guess the idea behind the drawing was that there's design intent, and then they're showing every single tiny little detail that you could ever possibly imagine, and that's not the role and the scope of construction documents. Well, in California, at least where I am nowadays, that is the role of construction documents. I mean, you pretty much need to show every single little bolt and everything like that. Do you guys have any thoughts on that conversation of how, what is the role of construction documents in terms of instructing the contractor about what they're supposed to build?
We lost your video feed, by the way.
Okay, I'll see if I can turn that back on. Thanks.
Okay. Marilyn, would you like to address that?
Sure. I mean, I think...
there you go.
I think this is a tricky thing because I think it has a lot to do with the project, and I think it has a lot to do with the jurisdiction, and I think it has a lot to do with the contractor that you're working with. And also if you're in a design build situation. So I was doing some of that when I was a contractor, and I love thinking about projects that I did, like fairly large projects, on like 5 or 6 sheets of drawings, because I knew what was going to happen, because I was doing both things, and I knew who the crew was going to be, and so I could just be super quick and super slim with the amount of information I was putting on paper. And it's why I believe strongly, if possible, to get a contractor on board early in the process. Because if I know, as a designer, if I know who my contractor is and what their capabilities are and all of that, then I can make my drawings to reflect that, to suit that. Otherwise, if I don't know who the contractor is, I have to assume that they don't know everything, that they can't read my mind or whatever. So I have to draw a lot more. So I think that there's something in that. I'm trying to figure it out for my own practice, and sort of a larger question is how can we get better about sort of drawing less in a way? I love to draw, but I think there's a way to draw less, and I think that that's about developing relationships with contractors and architects.
Rand, your take on it?
We actually, because our practice is nationwide, we end up bidding out projects all over the United States, and it's almost impossible for us or our client to even know who's going to build it. So we do have to draw more. And it's quite common for us to produce anywhere from 35, 50, or even 70 sheets in a set, depending on what the client has asked us to do. And it's not always just our choice. For instance, we find that we like to do our interior elevations when the client asks us to have that added. A lot of people call that cabinetry. It's not just cabinetry, it's the walls behind the cabinetry and other things like the appliances in the kitchen. So there's a lot of interior architecture involved as well. We provide more sheets, and sometimes we get criticized for that, but we do, for instance, some of our drawings at a 1-inch scale. And the reason is because there's not necessarily more stuff, it's just shown larger so you can see what it is. Because if you draw at 1/4-inch scale and you're trying to show some detailed things, that's really hard to see. And so, if you're trying to get a cabinet guy or mason or somebody to do things and trying to relate and trying to align to something, trying to allow for certain utilities or something. So we end up having more sheets, but we draw at a larger scale so that they can really see what's going on. So we tend to err on the side of having more drawings. And within those drawings, some people might infer there's more information, although we really think there's probably about the same amount of information, and it actually eliminates questions. We normally get hardly any questions during bidding. And the reason is because we have the specifications and because the documents are so thorough. We typically, and when you start adding them up, you really get a lot of sheets. You got a floor plan for each level, you got a roof plan, you got an elevation, at least 4 usually, and then you might have a blow-up detail exterior elevation if you're doing something special, like with masonry joints or stone joints or something around some kind of a special tower for stairway or some feature element. And then some people do, we don't do reflected ceiling plans, for instance. A lot of people do. And so that automatically, if you got 3 levels involved, that jacks your setup by another 3. You got specs, that's usually anywhere from 4 to 15 sheets, depending on what systems are involved in your project. You really better be doing a door schedule and a finish schedule. You're going to get in trouble with your local board of architecture. There's also master details that we include, like when you have steel lintels over masonry openings and the flashing involved with that, and how all the joints are supposed to be weeped, and all those things that get architects in trouble, we try to make sure are in the set. And you really should be doing building sections, at least one or two at least. And then you ought to be doing wall sections, because wall sections is typically where the local building official is going to get your R ratings and your U ratings, which they want to see on the drawings, so they don't have to go digging for it. So, and then if you have a tile sheet, and then if you have a sheet of index, and then if you have a sheet of general notes and definitions, your set's going to get pumped up. And we, quite frankly, if somebody's got a problem with the number of sheets, that's really not our problem. What we're trying to do is do a faithful job to make sure that we comply with the health, safety, and welfare guidelines involved with our licensure, and also to help the contractor understand what he's getting into, so that he can get a reliable price, so that he won't be inclined to have change orders for our clients. So that's our perspective on that.
And that's a wrap for another show about the business of architecture. If you enjoyed today's show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. There are 2 reasons to do this. First, it encourages me to continue making free content for you to run a fulfilling and profitable practice. And secondly, it allows others to find this content inside of iTunes so that they can benefit as well. For free resources for running an architecture practice that is both fun, flexible, and profitable, visit businessofarchitecture.com and click the join button to unlock your account to Business of Architecture Insider. As a member, you'll have access to free tools and resources to help you get more clients, boost profitability, start a firm, and much more. Until next week, this has been the Business of Architecture.
Everybody knows that you just gotta do it anyway.
The views expressed on this show by my guests do not represent those of the host, and I make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you conquer the world. Bump music credit to Ben Folds 5, Do It Anyway.